Hello, everyone. This is Mike Steckline, partner with the Institute for Enterprise Excellence. Hope everyone's having a good day. I've got a kind of an update webinar today on a topic we talked about in July, and I'm going to try to run an experiment to see about continued learning around this topic of the Cynefin sense-making framework and some lessons that we've been learning, as well as some perhaps people that have been using the framework interested in sharing their observations today. Normally, I would have the phones unmuted and be listening to a presenter. I'm going to have the phones, normally the phones are muted. I'm going to have the phones unmuted today so people can interact and ask questions as we go. And you can also use the chat function to type in questions or provide input for those that are on the call today. This is going to be recorded so that you and others can benefit from the recording a little bit later. So building on some things that we talked about last time in July, I posed a question related to our model that we talk about at the Institute for Enterprise Excellence. We call this the sustainability model. And I honed in specifically on this principle of think systemically, but I wanted to think about systems and what kind of system am I dealing with. And the topic for today's conversation is what happens when there's a mismatch between the kind of system I'm dealing with, and I think that it's another kind of system. And what does that mean? So if you were not able to participate in July, we had a webinar that you can go to that bit.ly link and listen to the recording about the Cynefin model. And the next couple of slides, I'm going to go through some information that it is perhaps a repeat, but I just want to lay the foundation on some things that we've been learning around this. So we think in terms of a continuum of systems. On the right-hand side, those that are of a predictable nature and those that are unpredictable. And on the right-hand side, terminology that we're using is the ordered systems. They come in two parts. One is originally the terminology for an ordered system of this type was a simple system. The latest terminology being used is it's an obvious system. Everyone can agree on what you should do when you have a simple system or an obvious system. And this is when you know that pretty confident about the relationship between causes and effects. You can be pretty certain about this. This is what's called having fixed constraints. And we'll get more into what do we mean by constraints a little bit later, as well as in future offerings. Examples of obvious systems when people have reduced things down to a recipe or a checklist, procedures. In lean terminology, people call it standard work. And this can be termed best practice. What do we think about as the best way to do something? The decision-making model is you sense what's going on, you categorize it, you put it into a category, and then you respond accordingly. And everyone does it pretty much the same way. So that's one example in that quadrant. Now, still on the ordered side, but up on the upper right-hand quadrant, I've got something a little bit different. Although it's ordered, there's a relationship between cause and effects, but it's not evident, at least not apparent. The kinds of constraints that we have going on here are called governing constraints. And so this is where you require some expertise. And even if you have expertise, the experts may not agree. So this is where some analysis is needed. This is what we call contrasted to best practice. This is what's called good practice. And the decision-making model is we sense what's going on, we analyze things, and then we respond accordingly. I've just put some high-level examples here where I think this is taking place, where you have expertise in medicine, law, engineering, systems that have many moving parts, putting together rockets that can go to the moon and back, the moonshot. It's a complicated process, but you can see cause and effects, and you can understand the analysis. On the upper left-hand corner, and this gets into the unpredictable or the left-hand side of this quadrant, we have systems that are complex. And the word complex adaptive systems is something that people may be familiar with. And this is where cause and effect may be understood, but usually only in hindsight when you look back on things. And this is where we have unpredictable and emergent outcomes. The kinds of constraints that we have here are called enabling constraints. And this is where you have contrasted with best practice, good practice. This is where we have emergent practice. Something emerges from interacting in complex adaptive systems. And so the decision-making model here is we probe, we think about experiments, things we can try, and then we sense and then respond accordingly. And this is where you would see a lot of safe to fail experiments. And I'm going to say more about the amplify and dampen a little bit later. And then I think there's many examples of these kinds of systems. Many times when you're dealing with people or strategies that you want to try and you want to experiment with those, I think you're dealing with complex adaptive systems. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about this lower left-hand corner, which is the chaotic system. And I just added a little curve at the bottom to show that the boundary between these systems, between the obvious and the chaotic, is different. This is where there really are no effective constraints. It's a free-for-all. You can enter it accidentally, and the strategy you want to do is to stabilize first. You can actually enter into it deliberately, and this is where people can come up with innovative solutions where you remove the constraints and try to do some fundamentally different things. In this domain here, you're trying to act first, then sense, and then respond. Often used example is when there was the 9/11 2001 attack and all chaos was going on. Someone had to act, decide what needed to be done, sense how that worked, and then respond accordingly. And this is where novel practice emerges. And there is a fifth domain to this, and it is the disordered domain. It's the area in the middle, where this is often where we find ourselves. We don't know what kind of system we're dealing with, and we're trying to sort things out. So just building on that framework a little bit, the so what to this is, why would you want to know about this? Well, depending upon what kind of space you're in or what kind of system you're dealing with, it requires you to act differently. So there's no one size fits all. There's no one approach. There's no one method that's going to address every kind of a system. The interesting thing is, we as human beings, we tend to interpret the situations based on our individual preference for action. So we may look at the world and say, it's obvious or simple, and that's our bias, and we'll perhaps treat a complex system as if it was simple, or vice versa. We'll treat everything as if it's complex. In reality, perhaps it's more of a simple or an obvious situation. And I'm going to have more to say about that in a little bit. Back to this border between the obvious and the chaotic, there's this idea of a complacency zone. And what happens here? So this is what happens when you start to believe that you are dealing with an ordered system. You have overly structured, overly bureaucratic processes. You start to believe that things worked well in the past, it's going to work well in the future, and you can find yourself suddenly falling over this cliff, and that's what this little wave is intended to show, where you find yourself in a chaotic situation, and to recover is going to be very difficult. Now, another thing to build on beyond what we talked about last time was this border here between the obvious and the complicated. I'm thinking it is less than a distinct border and more of a continuum. So it isn't always clear. I think there's a continuum of things that are more obvious, things that are more complicated, but perhaps it's not a strong linear relationship here. Something new that's been added to this model in the last couple of years or so, and most recently this past year, is what's called these liminal spaces. And this has to do with navigating around this model. So again, what is the benefit of learning this model? You will come up with different strategies about how could you take something that is complex, do some experiments, and move it into the complicated, or even parts of it could be moved into the simple and the obvious. So I'm going to share some things that can be found from a blog post from Cognitive Edge, one of Dave Snowden's blog posts, and it's at that bit.ly link you can find there. But these are some things that I've learned related to this liminal space, or the spaces between here. So we talk about experimentation or pilots, or things that you're going to have prototypes. And the idea is that there is this space. You're dealing with a complex system, but you're trying to figure out, what could I do? How could I respond? And you're trying to think about moving things perhaps into more of a complicated sort of a zone to be able to address those things. And so there's this zone of experimentation. This other space over here that isn't in that liminal zone, it has to do with high levels of ambiguity. And this is where, as you're trying to cope with a complex system, thinking about parallel safe-to-fail experiments is a starting point, and those may move into something that may be more of a deliberate pilot over on as you move forward. Now there's another space here, and it's between the complex and the chaotic. And Dr. Snowden originally described this as taking a shallow dive from a complex space and then going into the chaotic, as some intentional effort where you're trying to introduce some innovation. You want to try to do something quite a bit differently. So you remove constraints and allow people to do some free experimentation. Something interesting occurs here if you think about this line that's been drawn here, that it is cuts this disordered space into two parts. One part is on the left, this is where we know what we don't know, and this one is, well, we don't know what we don't know. We're still trying to figure out what's going on with the system. Now, backing things up a bit and talking about, so how is this compared with some of the other things that have been proposed relative to coping with systems? And I like this diagram here. This is a 2x2 matrix of looking at things, and I've got another 2x2 matrix I'm going to share in a bit. This comes from a great YouTube video. You can go to the bit.ly link on the lower left-hand corner. But placing this Cynefin framework within this model, we think in terms of, first of all, on the horizontal axis, scientific methods, left-hand side, or case-based methods, right-hand side. So strategies based on good solid science on the left-hand side. Right-hand side, people study a number of cases, form some sort of an idea about how things work, and then they pursue advice or moving forward based upon the cases that they see. And then on the vertical axis, levels of predictability, and then also explanation. On the lower left-hand corner, classical science, very predictable, solid. And the Cynefin framework fits in the upper left-hand corner, where you're thinking about, it's science-based, you're explaining how things work, and it is scalable. Both of these are scalable at a low risk. That means you can spread this. On the right-hand side, when we think in terms of examples, looking at case-based approach of different cases, studying different organizations, seeing what they do, and then trying to imitate that, that is comes at a higher risk. And then on the lower right-hand corner, described as pseudoscience, where people have put forth simplistic recipes or some overhyped promises about things that are going to work. Those are some what we might consider as far as danger zones. And so just wanted to step back and put the Cynefin framework into that context as well. Really recommend looking at that YouTube video that I've got on the bit.ly link on the lower left-hand side. So in this section, I want to start talking a little bit more about some lessons that we've been learning thus far. And one of the key lessons is with complexity science, whether you're talking about human systems of various types, it really does require new and different language. And so the introduction of different terms that may not be familiar in the nomenclature for many people. These are some of the words and the terms that are showing up. And in future webinars in this topic, if people find this of interest, I'm going to be unpackaging some of these definitions so that we can learn a little bit more about that together. This is another 2x2 matrix, again, thinking about where this fits in terms of experience that people have had. And on the around the periphery, there's different lead authors on different topics. So you may have heard about Frederick Taylor or Michael Hammer related to process engineering, process design. The lower left-hand corner, we think of that as the scientific management approach. On the lower right-hand corner, years ago, 10, 20 years ago, I recall introduction by people such as Peter Senge and others around what became known as systems thinking or systems dynamic fits into this lower right-hand corner. And I think a part of what we're learning related to complex adaptive systems and the Cynefin framework really is quite different. And so there's some discussions that go on about how this is separate from, or at least different from, what people are thinking in terms of traditional systems thinking. And it has to do with treating human beings like human beings and not like machines or a mechanized approach. So here's some of the other key lessons that we've been learning thus far. And it has to do with just building on what do we mean by that anthro-complexity component and really understanding some unique aspects of human systems. First, humans make decisions based on patterns. They create and maintain multiple identities. Every person has multiple identities at the same time, perhaps, but I can be a parent, I can be a son, I can be a brother, I can be a teacher, and I can carry out these different identities, and that's something that is unique to human systems. Humans have a tendency to ascribe intentionality and cause where none is necessarily in existence. So this can be a challenge. And we've learned how to structure our social interactions to create order. There's also confusion of correlation with causation, and also a confusion of simulation with prediction. And so these are some things, some considerations when we're dealing with human systems that we have to be cognizant of and think about. So the fundamental thrust of this conversation, and what I'm going to be asking for some input from you folks that are on the webinar today, is the mistakes that are made when we have an initiative or project that was really was ordered, but it turned out to be complex. So we treated it as something that was simple and obvious, and then we ended up realizing that it was actually complex. Now, Dave Snowden tells this story about hosting a children's party to help to make this distinction different. And in the lead up prior to this webinar, I sent out the link, and I've got a summary of that story that I'm going to be just sharing so that everyone is familiar with that. But I want to talk about, and then also solicit from folks that are on the webinar today, any examples where that we encountered where we were really in actuality dealing with a complex system, but we were treating it as if it was ordered. So here's a synopsis of the hosting a party for 9-year-olds. And when I make the recording for this, I'm going to insert a recording of Dave Snowden going through this scenario in the example. I'm going to insert it here.
Now, the best way I've ever learned to explain this is to think about how you would manage a party for a bunch of kids. So can everybody imagine running a party for a bunch of 9-year-old children? Everybody got that? And you're holding it in your own house. This is a mistake. The whole point about community centres and church halls is they have fire hoses. Fire hoses are vital for cleaning up after a party and are occasionally necessary for crowd control during the party itself. So you're holding the party in your own home. The first decision you have to make is an ontological decision. Which type of system are we? So if you assume the system is chaotic, it means the children are unconstrained and their behavior is random. So they'll probably discover drugs and alcohol and go on a personal experience of self-discovery. Yeah, your house may burn down in the process, but all property is theft and it was socially constructed in the first place, so why are you worried about it? Yeah, I don't recommend this approach. I've got a friend in California who did try it once, but he's never going to do it again. The recovery cost is too high. The ordered approach, on the other hand, is taught in all good business schools. Under this, it's of critical importance to agree learning objectives for the party in advance of the party itself. The learning objectives should be aligned with the mission statement for education in the society to which you belong, and should be clearly articulated and printed off on motivational posters with pictures of eagles soaring over valleys and water dropping into ponds. And you should put those posters around the walls of where you're going to hold the party. As the children come into the party, they should be given Disney cards with the party value statement printed on the back, so they're fully aware of it. Yeah? We don't want them to, don't follow that. And then actually you produce a project plan for the party with clear milestones throughout the party against which you can measure progress against ideal party outcome. Yeah? The senior adult then starts the party with a motivational DVD. You don't want children wasting time in play which isn't aligned with the learning objectives. And then they use PowerPoint to demonstrate their personal commitment to the party objectives and show the children how their pocket money and allowances are linked to the achievement of the milestone targets. Following the highly successful completion of the party, you conduct an after-action review, update your best practice database on party management, and mandate future process improvements. If at this stage, for any remote reason, the children aren't happy, you hire an appreciative inquiry practitioner who will get them to tell happy, clappy stories, so they have happy mental models and suitably indoctrinated like whatever you put in front of them next time. Everybody reasonably familiar with this approach to party management? I've got to build mindfulness into that sometime soon. I haven't quite worked it out yet, but it will be there soon. The complex systems approach, on the other hand, is much simpler. We start off by drawing a line in the sand, known as a boundary in complexity theory. We look the children solidly in the eye, and we say, cross that, you little bastards, and you die. And one of the things you learn pretty fast as an adult is the value of flexible, negotiable boundaries. Because rigid boundaries have a habit of becoming brittle and breaking catastrophically. Yeah? We then introduce catalytic probes. I'm deliberately using technical language here because you need to think differently about this. All right? If we don't change language, we don't change the way that people think. Yeah? We introduce probes, safe-to-fail experiments. Yeah? A football, a video, a barbecue, a computer game. See if a pattern forms? If it does, it's called an attractor. If it's beneficial, other kids will get attracted to it. They'll start to play. At which point, if it's okay, we don't take resource away or we give it resource. If it's negative, well, that's where you need the fire hoses. Yeah? So what we actually do, and this is probably the key phrase of complexity, we manage the emergence of beneficial coherence within attractors, within boundaries. And that allows locally valid solutions to merge. Something which works next to a teaching hospital in Cardiff ain't going to work somewhere in Machynlleth where it's 4 hours to get to hospital. Yeah, you need a similar governance structure, but you've got to have that ability to actually see patterns and respond to positive or negative patterns. Different things will work at different times in terms of the way it works.
But essentially, he takes you through, if you're going to host a party for children and you treat it as if it's a chaotic system, it's essentially it's a free-for-all. You let the children do whatever they want to do, no constraints. If you treat it or assume that it's an ordered system, something that Dave used the example of, that this is the approach taught in nearly every MBA course, where you would establish learning objectives prior to the party, which would be aligned to the mission. You'd have motivational posters on the wall, and kids would be given Disney cards with a party value statement on the back. There would be a project plan for the party with clear milestones to achieve. The senior adult would begin the party with a motivational DVD, give a PowerPoint presentation that they would demonstrate their personal commitment to the party, and then perhaps link the children's allowances to having a positive party outcome. And then after the completion of the party, conduct an after-action review, some people would say a PDSA, where they would up-to-date the database on best practice and then mandate future party process improvement. And then finally, if at the end of the party children are not yet happy, you would hire an appreciative inquiry practitioner to tell happy stories and produce happy mental models. And then another example would be, what if it was a complex adaptive system? What would you do? Well, you would establish boundaries. There would be some fundamental rules about what the kids could and could not do. But then you would introduce catalytic probes, and these are safe to fail experiments, and you would see what emerges. And this pattern of play that emerges is called an attractor. So what do we mean by different kind of probes? Well, introduce a football, a game, a DVD, some sort of activity for the kids. And if it's positive, you would amplify it, you would give it attention, and you would give it resources. And if it's negative, something you don't want, then you would dampen it and take that away. And this is where we understand that when we're dealing with a complex system, we're managing the emergence of beneficial coherence within attractors, within a boundaries. And I'll have more to say about that as we go. So the assignment, the thing to think about here is to think about some examples where we are dealing with a complex system, but we're treating it as if it was obvious or simple. And so I've got two listed on this slide, and I've thought of these, but perhaps you could think of some, and I'd like to get your input. So one thing I've noticed is as people are trying to get better and better patient satisfaction, so this is a healthcare example, they have scores that are given month by month where they get feedback from customers, usually on phone calls or something on the internet. And when you're off target, where it's red, any variance from the goal requires management to complete, in this example, a 5 why problem solving form, which will generate an action plan to improve next month's score. So I thought of that as one example where the satisfaction of patients in a hospital, I think, is really in the realm of something that's complex. You have many different interacting parts, many possibilities. Cause and effect is always not clear. And I'm wondering in this example if the action that we often prescribed as far as asking people to explain variances and then form some sort of a action plan on that isn't a mismatch between the kind of system we have, which I think is complex, and treating it as if it's an ordered system. So I'm going to pause between each of these examples and get input from the folks that are on the webinar today, either verbally, just chime in, the phones are unmuted, or type in something on the chat function to provide your input here. So what do you think about that as an example where there's could be a mismatch between something that in actuality is a complex system, but we're treating it as if it was simple or obvious? I'm going to pause and see what input people have. Anybody on the webinar work in a hospital or work in an emergency department or been to an emergency department?
Hi, Mike, it's Les.
Hi, Les. How you doing?
Okay, so I'm just wondering if the initial assumption, I mean, if I take a half a step back, I'm saying, if I'm looking at something over here and I really want to kind of understand it or I have an issue, I'm going to try to root cause it.
Mm-hmm.
So if I'm root causing it, then are we saying that we stepped in, we thought it was easy, we stepped in and it was hard, or we failed to root cause it and that's why we have a problem?
Yeah, I think that, depending upon what we've been taught or how we treat these things, it may not always be so simple to say the data from last month's input from customers, patients, is going to give us some clues about what caused them to, a certain percentage of them to not be as happy as they could have been, and trying to go back in time and try to create something with that data, as opposed to saying, so today's patients, what could I do today with today's patients and run some experiments about different ways of creating different interactions with them, so that I would think that that would be more of something more in line with something that's a complex system. What experiments could I run, try different things with today's patients, as opposed to trying to explain what happened to last month's patients. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Here's another example I thought of, and again, it has to do with healthcare, because a lot of our work is in healthcare. So executives going around to different units on designated hospital units, and they have a scheduled basis, and they've got scripted questions they want to ask, and they're required or asked to talk to 3 staff members and 3 patients along these scripted questions. And then based on those responses, they're going to put that into a problem-solving database for the hospital. And I could have carried this further as far as, so what would happen next, but there would probably be someone that would be required to look into these issues and then try to solve problems that came up when the executives did their rounding. So it's one type of rounding that I've noticed that is going on in healthcare. And this too, I think, might be an example where there's more complex things going on that will not lend itself to sort of this structured recipe approach to try to make the situation better for staff or for patients. So again, it's another example. I may be off track on this here, but I know that many of you that perhaps have something like this in the organizations. Do you think that perhaps there might be a mismatch as far as what do we get from executives that go around and ask scripted questions and then putting that data into a database? Do you think it's that recipe or that structured approach is going to make the experiences of staff or patients better in the future? And I'm going to pause again and see what your thoughts are.
Mike, it's Les again. I think that from a rounding perspective, there's certainly, I think that in many instances, what I see is that the questions are canned kind of to the point where you're rounding on like the same people every other month.
Mm-hmm.
And so that the value of the rounding is diminished.
Mm-hmm.
And so then you have to come back and question the value of the data that you're collecting versus the effort that it's going to take to kind of go through it. And I think that there's certainly, I think that it's a different type of system. I kind of think there's, what I've seen is that the rounding piece, like I said, the scripted piece gets so hardwired that it loses some of its impact.
Mm-hmm. And so it could be like taking,
and it winds up coming into a problem-solving database which for the most part is not managed in a manner that shows people on a regular basis that, hey, we're listening to you and this is what we've done.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, so it might be an example, and going back to the children's party, why would you do that to a group of kids and treat it in a structured way? Having things that are scripted or not genuine or just doesn't match as far as what you're doing with. So that it sounds like we may be making that mistake when we're treating something like this as simple or obvious when it's actually more complex. I had one group of people that told me that they knew when the administrators were coming, and the last question that they asked was, "Is there anything you need from administration?" And they asked the same questions every time, and the staff got to the point where they realized that it was non-value added time for them. So they put up a sign when the administrators were there that basically said, "No, we don't need anything from administration today." And so again, people will find a workaround that says, what's the value added of doing things this way? So thanks for sharing that, Les. Any other thoughts from people that are familiar with rounding processes that are tried in either healthcare or other organizations? Okay, I came up with a third example, perhaps something that people are familiar with. So every month, every manager receives a report that shows where the line items on their expenses exceeded the budgeted amount by 10% or more, and or if the amount is over $500. And then every manager is required to provide an explanation for that, why there was a variance from budget and what they are doing to keep it from happening again in the future. And so, again, this is another example where I thought probably there's more complexity going on that can be addressed with this simple approach. And it doesn't even get into the problem of trying to ask people to explain random variation. But has this been an experience that people have had? And do you think that this could be another example where there's a mismatch between um, something that's complex and treating it as simple or obvious? Anybody ever had to explain variances?
All right, I'll play.
There you go.
So, I think one example that's appropriate is, for example, so let's say in my budget I have office supplies,
Mm-hmm.
and it's $12,000 a year, let's say, right? And so in 1 month, I spend $5,000. So now I have a variance. But I had to buy 5 chairs to replace 5 chairs that broke. So in essence, I used half my budget for the year in this 1 month period. Now, I may already know that that amount that I initially budgeted will cover me for the year, but in this particular month, it's going to cause a huge variance, right? So now we have to explain that variance, but I also think that it's an example of you have an unknown complex situation coming in. Okay, a bunch of chairs broke, they need to be replaced. And okay, then you can step in and say, okay, well, why did they break? Why did 5 chairs break? Why did they break in different areas? Why did they break in one area? Did they break a month after the warranty expired? So I think there's more and more that you can dig in there, and then you can say that, so from there, you say, what are you trying to do to keep it from happening in the future? Well, you don't know because you have to do more research. More information is needed
Mm-hmm.
to be able to come up with an answer to that. And it may be that there's nothing that you can do about it because, chairs are just going to break.
Yeah. So it may be something that, again, you've mentioned many different variables of consideration that really are more appropriate for understanding as opposed to a recipe approach that said, fill out this form, explain every variance, and then do better next month. That
Well, it's the same thing. For example, like surgery. Surgery is highly variable.
mm-hmm.
So let's say I budget $750,000 a month, and then 1 month I'm at 750, and the next month I'm at 1.2. So now we have to go back and say, well, what? Now when we go back at it retrospectively, we have to say what changed.
Mm-hmm.
Did something change? Okay, so now I look at what's existing in the current state. What changed in that last time period? So, for example, did I have a new surgeon that came in that asked for a bunch of new supplies, and that caused variance? Did I have a push in volume? Did I, instead of doing 5 total joints, did I do 25 total joints, and that's causing my variance? So I think that those are, again, that's where the variance is really unpredictable on a month-to-month basis, but you have to understand the things that are driving into that variance. And so it very well may be that things were somewhat ordered. I have 10 doctors that basically do the same kind of bucket of procedures, and I understand my costs they have less variability on a month-to-month basis. Mm-hmm. Then a new contract comes out, I lose 5 surgeons. Now I have to bring in 5 other surgeons and try to figure out how I'm going to make up that volume, let's say. So I could be above or below, but the process, I think, is still the same of saying, okay, all of a sudden I went from something that I thought was orderable to now it's completely is it completely chaotic, or is it a way to put some predictability into it?
Mm-hmm.
I think that it depends on the person. I mean, one person might just roll with it and say, okay, my budget's off, and I'm going to say, you know what, based on this, based on this reduction in surgeries, these other guys came in and they cost more, and that's why I have variance.
Mm-hmm.
But you can also introduce an element of predictability into it by, let's say you step back and you analyze these 5 surgeons that come in, you ask them questions, you say, okay, what kind of procedures are you doing? What kind of volume are we projecting? And then you can sit down and you'd actually write out your little business case that kind of structures that out. And so now when you have variance, you have a better model to go back to say what's driving your variance. And I think today, like in hospitals, a lot of it is, when you introduce a new service, you're doing that business case, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're following that business case once you actually get it funded and it's moving forward. Month to month, it's more like, okay, why were you over budget? I don't know. I got to go back and see, and it always comes back, is it rate or volume?
Mm-hmm.
In this particular case, but how you approach that is very individualistic. You can have people that are very ordered and they try to mitigate that as much as possible. And you can have some people that are a little bit more loose in how they look at these kinds of things, but it doesn't necessarily mean that one approach is better than the other. I think it really depends on the personality of the person that's dealing with it, the person that they're interacting with, how do they want the data, and then being able to, provide something that actually makes sense. Mm-hmm. I mean, does that even make sense, or am I just totally off track?
No, I think it makes sense. And I'm going to go back to this slide and just share that in this situation, it sounds like maybe sense, analyze, respond. Going and thinking about it is maybe it's not complex, but at least it's complicated. It's going to require some expertise to work through. Might be a more appropriate approach as opposed to a canned one size fits all approach that can move forward. So appreciate that input. I got the little spinning wheel going on my computer situation now, so. Okay, it's done spinning. No. I guess I got too fancy with my presentation today. So I without being able to move the slides around here, I seem to have something going on with my computer. I'm going to close down this session today. I just wanted to get input from folks. Let me ask one more question here. I've given you 3 examples of situations that could be construed as perhaps something you can approach with a simplistic approach when actually it's either more complex or complicated. And I gave you 3 examples. For those that are on the webinar day, can you think of examples where you maybe have experienced that mismatch between something that was complex and you treated it as simple? Any other examples that people have?
Okay, I'll play again.
Les is going to play.
So I was doing a project. I was here at the hospital. I was kind of new, and I was having an issue with stocking out the emergency room.
Mm-hmm.
And so, working with the staff, we talked among ourselves, and we said, you know what, the stock level is just too low. Let's just go ahead and increase it. And at that time, we were starting to work on introducing some of the lean management principles in with the staff.
Mm-hmm.
And so we were adjusting the par levels, the stock levels and stuff, but the situation itself on a day-to-day basis was not improving. If anything, it was deteriorating. And so we thought that we were working on it. And then we decided we thought that we knew enough about lean where we said, let's do a rapid improvement event. So we got together with the people in the ED. The people in the ED said, you need to talk to this person and this person. And I brought in my staff, and so we went into the room and we went through different things, and we thought that we walked out of there with a basis of understanding of the things that needed to be adjusted, and the a little bit better understanding of the dynamics that were driving the things behind it.
Mm-hmm.
So we initiated that. We had an improvement for about maybe 2-3 weeks, and then the situation started to deteriorate again. And so what actually happened from there is that we actually went to formal meetings, weekly meeting. You know, what's going on? Why is it happening? Still didn't get any better. And so we were going back and forth, and in the end, we did a combination of two things. One is that we were able to identify a subset of products that were causing the initial problem of stockouts, and we readjusted the shelving to accommodate more product and actually being more in line with the volumes that were increasing on a month-to-month basis in ER. And then the second thing was trying to align our activity to the activity that was occurring in the ER. So, you know, everything works on a wave. And what had happened is that fundamentally we came back, and after about 6-7 months, we finally realized that the time that we were putting product in the area was really the number one issue that was causing a lot of dissatisfaction. And so the staff, working with the ER staff again over months and months and months, we finally said, you know what, instead of putting stock in there at 8 o'clock in the morning, why don't we stock it at 3 o'clock in the afternoon?
Mm-hmm.
So we tried that, and we did our measurements and all that, and essentially we're at a point today where I have no complaints about the ER anymore. And it was really about going that it was trying to say, okay, here's a rudimentary, in retrospect, we had a rudimentary understanding that we executed a plan on, and it failed. And we continued to build on that rudimentary understanding, but that understanding in itself was flawed.
Mm-hmm.
And so it really took more time and more digging, and was past even 5 whys. I mean, we tried doing the 5 whys and still could not core address the issue. And really it was just kind of, you know, after we broke the bounds of assumption and said, you know, okay, we understand this big ball now. Let's see how we can address it differently. Forget everything else. We said, you know what? Why? Who says we have to stop first thing in the morning just because that's the way we've been doing it for years and years? You know, in talking to people and seeing the patient flow, we say, oh, okay, you know what? With the shift change happening here, doctors coming in here, shift change happening over here, those all create pushes on the supply chain within the hospital. So, you know, us, by understanding this and then experimenting and coming on, you know, in material management, it's fairly common to look at delivery times as part of your overall service delivery. So when we stepped back and looked at our service time and said, you know what, let's take a look in changing this and see if it has an impact, you know, based on the input that we had, it turned out that it had a huge impact. But it really took, you know, it was something where we had assumptions that we assumed that it was kind of straight ahead. We assumed the input that we were getting for the other department was correct. Turned out that none of it was true. So we were trying to take that ordered approach. The whole thing went from the upper right, from expertise down into chaos.
Mm.
And, you know, from chaos, it really took that going back and forth and, you know, just trying to get it day by day. Okay, am I going to get a phone call that stuff is out of stock? You know, so we need to step in and try to do something. And at the same time, we're trying to, you know, take this expertise approach to it. And really, it in the end, it wound up being like an adaptive process, I think.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like it was. And looking at what I found on the screen here, I figured out my snafu with the PowerPoint. So if we treated it as something simple and obvious here, what I heard you say, Les, is you needed to actually go into the complicated realm, sense, analyze, and respond to get the data to understand, get some expertise going on here. Run some experiments, which is a lot of what you're trying to do when it's a complex realm, and you can quickly find yourself in the chaotic zone if you're not careful. And what do you need to do to get out of that? So I just love that example. It's great.
And today, and I think that I think there's one of the key things here is that complacency zone, because I really think that there's really a very high risk when you say, we got it. And then you just assume that it's going to continue to work.
Yeah.
And you're not following up, or if you're not actually collecting measurement to be able to close your loop, it's very easy to have things actually just fall back into chaos. And so that's why I think it's important. You have to keep questioning, does it work? Can we do something better? Is there another way to look at it? And I think that evolves you into more of thinking. Initially, you think of things from a complicated perspective, and then it falls into chaotic because people want a result. And from there, in order to actually have something that involves people and product or services, you have to come up with a complex type of solution without falling into disorder. But once you have that solution, you have to keep going back and challenging that solution so that you don't fall into complacency. Because if you fall into complacency, you lose a lot of personal capital in trying to recover from that.
Yeah, those are great.
And so I really think that it's really important that, if you want to continue to be successful, you have to continue to challenge what you're doing on a moving forward basis.
I love that example. I think that's right on with what I've seen. So what I'm going to just show a couple slides here and then wrap it up for today, but I appreciate everyone's time today. And I appreciate you, Les, being willing to step in. And as you say, I'll play. So that was great. So here's some characteristics and implications when you're dealing with a complex adaptive systems. There are unintended consequences of actions that we take. We can't predict in advance what's going to happen, and we have to watch for unintended consequences. They tend to be highly sensitive to small changes. So there's dispositional, not causal relationships. So things are they have tendency to move in certain directions, but we can't necessarily see the causal relationships. A system is not more than the sum of its parts. All of these parts interact. There's serendipity and chance, and there's going to be perpetual novelty. So it's not as simple as dealing something that's clear cut. So just another slide here to think about some distinction between, if people have been reading and familiar with what's been called traditional systems thinking. And this is something that I've noticed in the work that we do, that we're going to have to pause and think about this. The tendency is to say, so what's the ideal future state, and then try to close the gap. But when you're dealing with complexity, trying to describe an ideal future state may not be the best action. What you're trying to do is to say, what could we move closer in a direction, again, setting up some safe to fail experiments and see how it emerges, versus trying to bridge a gap, which is, again, treating the organization that's complex as if it was a machine, where you can think of it that way. So managing in the present and creating a direction of travel is more important than trying to create false expectations or sort of a future world that's perfect. And this really stuck to me, and I've been thinking a lot about this, is when we're dealing with these complexities, do we do a disservice to try to set up what's the perfect ideal state that we were going to try to get to, and then how do we bridge the gap, and more about how do we create every day more stories that are about what we want to see and less about what we don't want to see. So more study to be done related to that. Just in terms of references, I've shared a lot of information today and appreciate your time and attention. I'm going to host some future webinars on this topic as we continue to learn about this. You can learn a lot by going to the Cognitive Edge website. The bit.ly link takes you to a short video, Dr. Snowden explaining the Cynefin model. What's going to happen next is the recording to today's session is going to be put onto the previous events. Later this month in August, Dan Robertson is going to be talking about A3 thinking, biases and heuristics, which is related to what we're talking about today, talking about human biases and the problems we have about problem solving. So I think that's going to be a very interesting topic of conversation. The folks from the Mayo Clinic Health System in La Crosse, Wisconsin on Friday, September 21st are going to share what they learned as far as using a method that's common in industry, in manufacturing, where you're trying to match demand with the supplies. And they came up with what they called a DCOP model, and essentially matching demand to resources. Very interesting example. And so Tanner Holst, who's a VP at that organization, is going to share that. You can learn more about that at the bit.ly link there. A number of topics in the works that you can see listed here. No one has yet come up with dates, solid dates for these, but many people have said that they've got topics they would like to share. And the last item on that is, as we learn more about complexity science and complex adaptive systems, I'll be inserting additional webinars on this topic within that. As always, if anyone on the webinar, either today directly or on the recording, has something that they would like to share, examples that they would like to share, just contact me and let me know, and we'll schedule a time so that we can all learn from the experience that you guys are having. So I appreciate everyone's time today, and so watch for the recording of this presentation coming to you shortly. Thanks and have a great day.